Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Monday, May 11th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, a recent Supreme Court ruling about contractors could have just as much impact inside the Pentagon. Plus, veterans have seen this story before, and they're paying close attention to what comes next. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. Military spouses were on Capitol Hill last week to push lawmakers to support legislation aimed at expanding access to capital and small business administration resources for military spouse entrepreneurs, an effort advocates say could help address the persistently high military spouse unemployment rate and improve military retention. Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis was there and joins us with more. Anastasia, thanks for being here.
Hey, Terry.
What exactly are the military spouses pushing for?
So military spouses are advocating for the Military Spouse Small Business Recognition Act. The bill specifically seeks to designate military spouse-owned businesses as a disadvantaged category under the SBA's 8A Business Development Program. What that would do for them is a couple of things. The designation would reduce borrowing costs for spouses by waiving SBA loan guarantee fees for loans up to $1 million. The fees usually add up thousands of dollars to the cost of borrowing, something that military spouses already can't afford. The bill would also reduce equity injection requirements by at least 5%. 5% might not sound like much, but right now military spouses who want to start or purchase a business are required to put down between 15 to 20% of funding upfront. So that's a significant barrier, and that would make it easier for military spouses to start a business. The designation would also allow military spouses to compete for set-aside and sole source federal contracts worth up to $4 million. And it would provide access to various resources like mentorship, training, other business development resources. Military spouses have access to it, but it's not really comprehensive. Another thing that the bill would do is it would require the SBA to track and report data on military spouse participation in SBA loan programs. There's really no data on how many spouses try to access SBA loans, how many spouses get it, how many spouses are rejected. So they really need that data to understand where they're at. Here's Stephanie Brown. She's the CEO of the Military Spouse Chamber of Commerce.
This is a movement. We're not asking for a handout. We're asking for recognition and the solution to address those structural barriers to success for small business owners. We represent every demographic in the country. Other groups have received this 8A designation. Military spouses represent every group. We're asking because of the service and sacrifice that we make to strengthen our military families.
What kind of feedback have they gotten from lawmakers so far?
So last Thursday, more than 50 military spouses hit the Hill. They met with members of Congress. They met with congressional staff. And we don't know yet, but they already might have 2 co-sponsors. But as of last week, they told me that 2 lawmakers are reviewing the bill. So the hope is they would get a commitment from them. In terms of the final draft, they said that once lawmakers review it, they will take another look at the bill based on their feedback. So, of course, things might change, and we'll see what the final version will look like. I also asked about the path forward for the bill. They said that if attaching the bill to the NDAA is the best way forward, that would be their goal. But it's really not clear whether they're attempting to push it for the 2027 NDAA or maybe for the 2028 NDAA.
Lawmakers have introduced bills like this in the past. What's different now?
The way Stephanie Brown described it is the work and the push it's just starting. The previous bill, when it was introduced, it was just an amendment, so that didn't go anywhere. But she said that now that they've learned a lot more about the process and how it works, they have an entire community that they're bringing here, that they're backing them. They're launching a big social media campaign. They're encouraging spouses to reach out to their representatives no matter where they are. So it's a much bigger effort. Here's Stephanie Brown again.
I've learned a lot in a short period of time, but we're coming back at it, bringing really the community to stand behind us. Not just the military spouse, business owners and budding entrepreneurs, but advocates like the Reserve Organization of America. And I'm a big believer that if the private sector is already doing something, then that should be key for the government to take note of. I think it's time, now is the time for the federal government to step up and do the right thing. So we're taking a very different, more active approach. The national campaign will launch after this event, and we will begin to put positive pressure and requests from military and family members all across the country on their elected officials following this event.
It seems like this effort might be swimming upstream a little bit. The Trump administration has not been quite the advocate of small business that previous administrations have been. What are some of the hurdles that this bill could face as it moves forward?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's what I asked. And the legislation could face scrutiny over a couple of things. The first and the big one would be the designation. Like why military spouses should receive a separate designation instead of qualifying through existing categories such as women-owned small businesses. Stephanie said that they get this all the time, why military spouses couldn't just qualify as women-owned businesses. But not recognizing military spouses as a separate group lumps them in with 60 million women-owned small businesses, and they're saying that they're asking for this based on their service and investment in national security, but this is something that will be a hurdle for them. And the next thing will be the next challenge will be is the cost. They don't know so far how much it's going to cost. There is no estimate so far, and that's going to be another challenge.
They try to make the case that this bill would lower unemployment rates and improve military readiness and retention. How do they connect those dots?
We've talked about it so much. The push comes as the military spouse unemployment continues to really outpace the national average. It's at 22%, which is 5 times the national average. And the reasons are frequent relocations, deployments, lack of affordable childcare, that all of that affect military spouse employment. As a result, starting or purchasing a small business, that has really become one of the more viable career options where spouses could take it with them. However, at the same time, establishing their own businesses in one place and picking it up and going somewhere else means that they have to reestablish the entire thing all over again. They have to reestablish their customer base, etc. And, at the same time, nearly half of military spouses are either self-employed, they own small businesses, or they're interested in owning a small business. And, if something like this were to pass, this would really help the unemployment rate because surveys show that military spouse unemployment is one of the main reasons that service members leave the service.
That's Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. Anastasia, thanks for bringing us the story.
Thank you, Terry.
You can find all the details at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, a Supreme Court ruling about contractors could have just as much impact inside the Pentagon. This is The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Tune in Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. for the Innovation in Government Show, sponsored by Carasoft. Hear from the industry leaders advancing the technologies shaping how agencies modernize secure operations and deliver better services. Innovation in Government covers what is changing now, what is working from cybersecurity and cloud to data, AI, and emerging technologies. Listen to Innovation in Government, Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. on Federal News Network. Search Innovation in Government.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. At stake in the Bagram bombing case is whether contractors retain broad immunity when supporting military operations, and how much legal distance the government can place between itself and the work it assigns. The outcome could shape how the Defense Department handles oversight and risk sharing in future conflicts. Lisa Himes, of counsel with Rogers Joseph O'Donnell, is back to give us an update on the case. Lisa, it's great to see you again. Thanks for returning to the show.
Thank you so much. It's great to see you again.
When we last spoke in October of 2025, this case was still kind of on its way towards the Supreme Court. Before we get into what's happened lately, just refresh our memory on the events of the case and the central issues.
Yes, in this case, there was an issue with a subcontractor to Fluor who was serving as a Afghan national employee for this subcontractor in Afghanistan. And this employee was part of this Afghan First program that was hired to work on the base, the Bagram Airfield base in Afghanistan. And the case stems from a 2016 suicide bombing by this Afghan national that was employed by the Fluor subcontractor. One of the individuals who was severely wounded, one of the victims, Hensley, sued Fluor under South Carolina law, and the lower courts ruled that the combatant activities exception protected the contractor, Fluor.
The Supreme Court, though, has actually ruled in favor of Mr. Hensley, correct? So what was their take on the combat activities exclusion?
Yes, the court ruled recently in a decision 6-3 with Justice Thomas writing the decision that there was no preemption in this case, finding that the Boyle, which I think we talked about before, did not apply. The Boyle decision from 1988 did not apply, and that there was no combatant activities exception for contractors under the statute. And we can get into that more too, the Federal Tort Claims Act exception for combatant activities, which applies to the military. The court found that it did not apply to contractors. And the court also found that there was nothing in the Constitution that provided for preemption.
Does this court decision actually have the impact of kind of redefining combat, or redefining at least how contractors engage in combat environments?
It will have, I believe, some significant implications and repercussions for contractors that are performing combat work overseas in support of the U.S. military. I mentioned this I wrote an article before the decision. We talked, and I also provided an amicus brief with my former colleague, Larry Ebner of the Atlantic Legal Foundation. And we touched on these issues about how important contractors are to combat operations for the U.S. military, and a decision not allowing for preemption of these types of cases will lead to significant changes in the way that contractors handle the combat support work. One thing I would add, though, is there was a strong dissent here, which I think is very important for folks to understand when they're looking at this case. So while the majority decision, which was 6 of the justices, held that there was no combatant activities exception here, that decision was actually 16 pages. And the dissent here, which was written by Justice Alito and joined by Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Kavanaugh, was a 19-page dissent. And it was a strong dissent. That dissent I view as one where, the dissent focused on the fact that the Constitution itself and the structure of the Constitution does provide for preemption. And that, they argued that the majority was getting it wrong. What I view the dissent as doing is providing a roadmap for the political question doctrine. So when I say that this will have significant changes, really what it does is it removes one of the options that contractors have for arguing that these cases, these types of combat cases, which involve state tort law, should not proceed. The combatant activities preemption, which I've argued in many cases and been successful in many cases, is now kind of off the table for contractors. And you're looking at the political question doctrine, which I argued prior to this case in an article that it was an alternate ground for dismissal here. I think the district court in the Fourth Circuit got it wrong. So I do believe that Justice Alito did a very good job of kind of providing that roadmap for political question. In fact, the first couple of lines of the dissent are actually questions that you ask in a political question type of case. So it is going to provide, I think, a reevaluation by contractors. So the contractors are going to look at this, and I think there's going to be an analysis of, are we doing things that are authorized by the federal government when we're over and performing work in support of the government? Are we following those directives? Because, if we're not, we're more hesitant to take on the work. Even the contractors that agree to do the work may stop and question what they're doing and say, well, am I implementing the military directives, or am I going slightly outside? Because ultimately, this case looked at allegations that the contractor floor was not following the military directives. And so essentially the majority, of the court is saying, well, those allegations are enough. That's all you need to ultimately prevent the immunity, essentially, of these contractors, or prevent the preemption. And I think that's going to be a big issue for contractors. That's a lot of explanation right there.
Lisa Himes is of counsel with Rogers Joseph O'Donnell. Lisa, I want to drill back in on one of the things you said there, which is relative to the political question and contractors following orders. How does this decision impact how the Defense Department is going to have to think about how they use contractors in combat environments?
I think they're going to have to think about where they put these contractors and what roles the contractors are given in supporting the U.S. military, because I think the dissent also does a good job of talking about how, if you have these contractors involved in these types of operations, which are essential, right now the military needs these contractors, then you could get into a situation where the military would otherwise be preempted under the combatant activities exception to the Federal Tort Claims Act, which is the statute itself, or under certain other grounds that we're talking about here, political question and whatnot. The contractors could be subject to suit here. And if the contractors are subject to suit, like in this case, the contractors are going to point the finger to the military and say, we were following the directions, and the directives of the military here. And then you have the situation which nobody wants to get into. The military doesn't want to be pulled into these types of cases where their folks are being deposed, where, certain sensitive information is getting out in litigation. So I think the government's really going to have to think about how they place these contractors, what contracts they're using these contractors to provide support, and do they have to now get the military to handle certain work that the contractors have been handling for the last several decades. So I think there's a lot of that kind of analysis, because, as I said, one of these options now is kind of off the table for contractors. So if political question doesn't apply, and that's going to be the question I think that we're going to see going forward, then there is less of an opportunity for contractors to do this work and then to ultimately get out of tort litigation when plaintiffs allege that they did something wrong.
The military remains engaged in active combat operations in the Middle East right now, today. Do you expect this decision to ripple through into current operations? And if so, how?
Well, I think right now the military is performing, combat operations, contingency operations and the contractors are providing that support, I think there's going to be this analysis that I mentioned by both the contractors and the military. And it may involve, an analysis of those contracts themselves, those directives, when you're actually on the ground, what those contractors are going to do on the ground in support of the military. Because again, you have the situation where they may stop to question, am I doing something that might not be quote unquote authorized, right? And the majority decision really looks at that and says, well, the issue here was that plaintiffs are alleging that this conduct was not authorized, right? That Fluor was engaging in. So, it gets very concerning for contractors. And I think it's going to be more the contractor saying, we need some documentation here that whatever work we're going to do for you is going to be authorized. Otherwise, we can't move forward with this type of, work that ultimately could come back and we could be involved in years-long litigation, and nobody wants that. So that's what I think is going to start to happen. I think you're going to start to see more of that.
The Supreme Court's decision ultimately allows Mr. Hensley's suit against Fluor to proceed. What will folks be watching as that case now finally begins to move forward?
I think folks are going to be watching to see whether the dissent, which I think really provides a roadmap for political question, whether the court, and this is the district court in South Carolina, ultimately finds that the political question doctrine bars the suit. I think, the language from that dissent, I mentioned the first couple questions that Judge Alito asks are political question type of questions. And then, the dissent, while it fights, hard for what it believes is this preemption based on the Constitution and structure, the dissent then really goes through all of these issues about how the military is balancing security and the strategic and policy objectives of promoting economic development in Afghanistan, which led to the Afghan First policy, which led to bringing on this Afghan national who ultimately was the suicide bomber. So I think, that balancing test is really a political question type test. When the military is making those types of decisions, that is something that the court should not intrude into. I've argued that many times and been successful, like the Taylor case, the Carmichael case, others. And I think that here there was some acknowledgement by the Fourth Circuit after the fact that while it did not find that the political question doctrine applied, it said that, later, after they had seen more down the road, right? This was I forget the exact language, but ultimately that political question was stronger than it had been at the beginning. And I think you're just going to see that the decisions that were made here by the military in that balancing test, and then also what would happen if this case proceeded, where military personnel would be hauled into court, deposed, and there would be all of these sensitive documents that would be coming out. That's where political question applies. And so I do think that the language in the dissent makes it clear that this is the type of case for which political question would apply, I believe. And so I think that's the way it's going to go. I think people are going to watch to see if the court does, in fact, find that the political question doctrine applies. If that is the case, the Fourth Circuit, I think the case will be appealed. Fourth Circuit would have to look at that once again. And I think that's my prediction as to how it's going to proceed.
Lisa Himes is of counsel with Rogers Joseph O'Donnell. Lisa, thanks so much for catching us up on this decision and its implications.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, Congress is heading into a busy legislative stretch, even as larger questions hang over its future. But first, veterans have seen this story before, and they're paying close attention to what comes next. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. When GI Bill abuse surfaced a few years ago, veterans' benefits kept flowing to schools that met higher education standards but failed veterans themselves. Now, as accreditation standards are back under review, advocates say lessons from that era still haven't been fully applied. They're pushing to give Title 38, the Veterans Benefits Law, a clearer role in determining which schools qualify for GI Bill dollars. Joining me to explain how those changes could better protect veterans before harm occurs is Vice President for Veterans and Military Policy at Veterans Education Success, Will Hubbard. Will, thank you so much for joining me. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
I feel like this has got to be a deja vu moment for you at Veteran Education Success. Many veterans groups remember the headlines from almost a decade ago when GI Bill money was flowing to for-profit universities that later turned out to be low quality or deceptive. Is what you're seeing now in the marketplace reminiscent of those times 10 years ago?
It's a great question. Unfortunately, the answer is yes. There tends to be a bit of a cycle when it comes to these predatory operations, and there will be turnover with their leadership, and they'll disappear for a bit. Sometimes there will be some regulations or some changes in the statute, and then they find new loopholes and new ways to get around it. And so we land right back here with, unfortunately, in the wake, students, their families sharing the negative stories and negative experiences that they've had, and we need to do it all over again.
Organizations like yours have spent years calling attention to these risks. The last round did result in statutory reform that ultimately was only implemented about 3 years ago. Really long tail for that process. Why is accreditation rather than enforcement after the fact now such a central focus of groups like yours?
People don't realize the role that accreditation plays for Title 38 or U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs education benefits, even though it's not directly responsive to Title 38, since it is within the Department of Education. It's a major gatekeeping element to ensure that the schools that get into the system to begin with are going to be offering some level of quality. And so even though it's not necessarily directly related to veterans, folks using their GI Bill benefits are definitely looking for some degree of quality. And sadly to say, it really has not been as successful as we would have liked to have seen, which is why we're calling for changes to accreditation and welcome the opportunity. Fortunately, we just see the direction of that conversation going the wrong way, not the right way.
Why do you think it takes so long for these kinds of concerns to surface into formal hearings or sanctions against these universities?
The reality is most students don't realize the lack of quality or lack of value, more importantly, of the credential or degree that they get from a university until. So a student, oftentimes a first generation student in the case of veterans and their families, may go through an entire progression of a program and then go look for jobs. And it's at that moment when they're not getting any calls back, they're not getting any responses or calls for interviews, that they realize that the value of their degree, unfortunately, is not all it was cracked up to be. And oftentimes they do their own research at that point and come to realize that they were either scammed or tricked into a degree that just frankly wasn't worth the paper that it's printed on.
I want to pull on something that you said right at the beginning of that response. You talked about first-generation students. The GI Bill really was, even in its initial founding, created to help people get that first generation into university. And it's still such an enabler. But what difficulty does that pose for the families who are trying to navigate this process?
For many individuals that are using education benefits of any type for the first time, perhaps the first to go to school in their family, they don't have the intrinsic cultural knowledge that many others take for granted. For example, they may not be familiar with what accreditation is or the different types of accreditation and why it matters. They may not be familiar with the different types of programs or resources at their disposal and how they can use them, and sometimes in combination. So there's really just a lack of knowledge. And it's unfortunately, it's that asymmetric information environment that schools prey on. They take advantage of the fact that these students are not familiar with the rules and essentially in the system because they've been told their whole life that education is important and good, which we agree with, but they don't know much beyond that. And those schools are the ones that are looking to find students who don't have that information at their fingertips to take advantage of.
I'm speaking with Will Hubbard. He's Vice President for Veterans and Military Policy at Veterans Education Success. Well, with that background, talk to me about what concerns you now about how the Department of Education is conducting its accreditation reviews today.
Unfortunately, it seems the department is more focused on culture war type topics versus pulling up their sleeves and getting the real work of accreditation reform done. The reality is culture wars, it affects such a small percentage of the population, and not an unimportant percentage, but that's not how you're going to fix the system by addressing issues related to these topics. So we just really would like to see accreditation actually focus on real standards and real outcomes, more so than having these strange culture war competitions. And the department's approach largely to this issue has been to focus on adding more accreditors. And the reality is that it doesn't matter if there's 5 accreditors or 5,000 accreditors. It's the standards that ultimately are what's important.
Is the Department of Education taking in voices like Veterans Education Success as they're considering accreditation?
We brought 2 student veterans to town recently and have more coming. One was a veteran themselves and one was a military spouse. And they tried to speak at the Department of Education proceedings in the first round of negotiations on the rulemaking, and they were denied the opportunity to speak, which is atypical. Normally, what the department allows at the end of each day is a public comment period so that anybody following the proceedings and any member of the public can share their particular perspective or voice on the issue. And that was something they were denied. So we were incredibly, disappointed to see that, but frankly, it wasn't quite a surprise that this department is continuing to not allow for a wide variety of voices in the conversation.
While these hearings are unfolding, veterans and military spouses and children are still choosing schools and spending benefits that they can't get back. So what does all of this uncertainty mean for folks who are trying to rebuild their careers and families right now using GI Bill benefits?
You highlight a critical point, which is if an individual uses their GI Bill and find themselves in a situation where they realize it was a scam operation or it was a very low quality experience and the marketplace is not reacting to their degree or credential, there's nothing for them to do except try to move on with their life. There's no way for them to get their benefits back. Unlike traditional students that may be using a Department of Education money or grants or loans, there are processes for them to get them restored. If, for example, courts find that it was fraudulent, so they can get their benefits back. But veterans and their family members are actually the only ones that are left out of that equation, because right now there's no statutory authority for the Department of Veterans Affairs to actually give those GI Bill benefits back. And that's something we're working very hard to change.
Will, walk us through a couple of examples of what this feels like from someone who's in the middle of it. You say you brought those 2 folks in to speak in the hearings. What was their experience like?
It's incredible to see these individuals who've had such difficult experiences with higher education, to see them advocate to legislators and their staff on Capitol Hill and in various departments and agencies. And there's such pain, but also passion to make it different, because they know that they're speaking on not only their behalf, but also their family, their friends, colleagues they've worked with, and frankly, everybody else that's coming behind them. So it's powerful to watch, but it's difficult to see it and understand that the system right now is not recognizing these concerns as valid. And that's something that we're working very hard to affect in a positive way. And we're always grateful for students who are willing to speak up, because that's how you get it done.
From the advocacy community's perspective, like yours, what kind of changes would you hope might be put in place to prevent the challenges we've just been discussing? There's
a number of very common sense changes that need to happen on the front end. For example, if a school is about to go out of business and collapse suddenly, there's nothing stopping that from being the case for GI Bill benefits purposes. Or if a individual is teaching a class under Title 38 benefits, there's no requirement that they have any expertise whatsoever in the material that they're teaching. you can quite literally pluck a person off the street and have them teach advanced physics. And there's nothing saying that that's not a problem under Title 38 right now. So there's a number of very common sense changes we'd like to see. And that's, we call that program approval standards. For a program or a school to be approved in the first place for GI Bill eligibility, they should meet very basic criteria. And there are, frankly, very minimal standards at present. So that's something that we would like to affect.
Well, here's hoping that it doesn't take as long this time to get the changes put in place.
I'm with you on that. I think really what it comes down to is anybody who's willing to speak up about their experience and raise their voice about the importance of having these changes, we certainly welcome that. And anybody who's looking for an attorney to speak with, our staff does that full time, totally for free. At the end of the day, we just want to make sure veterans get the most out of their higher education benefits that they've earned as they can.
I've been speaking with Will Hubbard. He's Vice President for Veterans and Military Policy at Veterans Education Success. Will, thanks so much for joining me, and thanks for bringing this issue to our attention.
Thanks, Terry. We appreciate it.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, Congress is heading into a busy legislative stretch, even as larger questions hang over its future. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Lawmakers return for a packed 2-week work period with several major bills queued up for action. At the same time, unresolved redistricting fights around the country are raising longer-term questions about the shape and capacity of the next Congress. Lauren Duggan, Deputy News Director for Bloomberg Government, joins us to sort through both the immediate agenda and what's coming next. Lauren, it's great to have you back. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Congress was out on recess last week, but as we've talked before, that doesn't mean nothing was happening. What's going on in the back rooms last week?
Well, we had a few things happening in public. They released the first version, at least, of what they want to pass to fund the elements of the Homeland Security Department that weren't funded with the spending bill that they passed right before the recess. So we have our first look at that. And then around the country, there was a lot of talk about redistricting and what that means for the current Congress, the future Congress, and, the voters going to the polls this year, who they're going to face in the different districts that House members have to run in. So it was not a quiet week, to be sure, even though the normal committee action and floor votes and everything weren't happening.
Let's dig into the redistricting, because the structure of that really is going to have some long legs into the future. The Supreme Court handed down a decision on the Voting Rights Act, and that started a whole lot of different balls rolling. Walk us through kind of what's happening across the country. Different states are taking this in a different approach.
Well, this is adding to what we had already seen over the course of the last 18 months or so as states have reconsidered how to draw their lines. If you look back to last year's action in Texas, where they redrew to create 5 seats that were maybe more favorable to Republicans, and then the California process that had to go on the ballot there and was approved by voters to create 5 districts, perhaps more favorable to Democrats, and then other action around the country. It ratcheted up a little bit with that Supreme Court case you mentioned, because that opened up things that have been done under the auspices of the Voting Rights Act by saying you couldn't have the same standard applied. And that's opened up things in a couple of states, most notably Louisiana, which is the case that was brought under, where there's 2 of these majority minority districts at play there. And then we've also seen action in Tennessee and discussion in other states as well. So a lot's happening there, just what's happened before and what's happening just now, as it's kind of been this additional turbocharge here at the end.
And just at the end of last week, the Virginia Supreme Court said that the new maps it developed and voted on in a statewide referendum couldn't be moved forward.
That's right. And that'll be a loss in Democrats' eyes, because they had hoped to go from a 6-5 delegation to a 10-1 if those districts had been upheld and carried forward. They could appeal. There may be some more action there, but that could be in jeopardy at this point. And that was one that had to go through two sequential sessions of the Virginia legislature, then get approved by voters. So Democrats there had to work through a lot of process to get there, but apparently in the eyes of the state Supreme Court, not all the right ones. And that's how that was struck down there.
When we think of all of this map redrawing, a bit of it seems like arcane political process, but it could have some real ramifications on Congress as we get to and through the midterms. What are people watching for how this is going to play out?
Well, people have to make decisions where to run, and people in some states are already making decisions who to vote for. One of the things that made this interesting in Louisiana is their primary is actually coming up Saturday the 16th, and they will perhaps move forward with the Senate primary, which is closely watched, but the House ones might not be able to carry forward because they have to decide if they're going to use these lines or different lines. So there's impacts like that. Around the country, there are not that many seats that are truly in play, and the ones you put into play or take out of play have a big impact potentially on who might be running Congress next year, because there are the idea of a toss-up seat that either party has a legitimate equal chance of winning. It's very few of those really across the country when you draw seats to be safer or leaning toward a particular party, as the parlance is with the people who look at this. So, as we've seen this year with a very minor majority, if you lose one or two seats, that can change your ability to govern, to get bills across the line in the House. And as Mike Johnson would probably attest, he's had a tough time with even the members he's had this year. So for either party who wins control at the end of this, they're gonna feel the impacts of these based on who wins and where.
So one of the impacts is how to manage what is a very tight margin in both chambers, relatively speaking. How does this affect the interpersonal dynamics on the Hill? We talk a lot about the need for relationships and compromise, and there's been a lot of conflict lately. Is this going to help or hinder that?
It probably adds to some of the interpersonal things that have gone on. It's people say it's nothing personal, it's politics, it's business, and every party is looking for a move forward here. And I think that's the tit for tat nature of what we've seen from state to state, and sometimes governors ribbing each other about what they're doing even about this has been a dynamic here. But there are serious questions about how to run the country and what approach you want to take to it between the two parties. And the president has obviously played a very personal role here. Even when the Indiana redistricting effort failed, he personally lent his name to some opponents of people who had voted against it on the Republican side of the aisle and knocked many of them out last week in the primary there. So this is big and important and does have effects across the country, not even just in Washington, but how some of these state legislatures operate.
Lauren Duggan is Deputy News Director for Bloomberg Government. Lauren, they're coming back into session this week with not only the redistricting behind them, the conversations that we just went through, but they've got a huge legislative workload for the next 2 weeks. Let's kind of walk through where some of the big legislative pieces are sitting. FISA, Ben, we've talked about that a lot. They got a 45-day extension on top of a 30-day extension, but they still have to pass that. What's the status there?
They do. The House got something through before they left, but they also attached to it this language that would prevent the Federal Reserve from creating a central bank digital currency, which prevented the Senate from really doing anything with it. They said that was dead on arrival. So they kind of hit the pause button on that, gave themselves until June. I imagine they'll need most of this work period, maybe even going into June, to figure out if the language that came over from the House is okay, if they want to amend it. So that is far from over, but at least for the time being, those expiring authorities were given a little additional lease on life.
And you mentioned the central bank digital currency. Crypto bill's been hanging around for a while. Any progress on that?
Some language was floated around. I think some senators were at some conferences over the week and talked about what they want to do there. So that is percolating. That's one of those things that time is going to run short on. The longer you don't get to mark up in Senate banking or come up with language, the harder it will become, especially with all the other things that they'll need to do around government funding and other issues. But that's at play for sure.
And we've got reconciliation version 2, I guess is what they're calling it, the one that will fund Customs and Border Protection and ICE.
That's right. That's the bill. We saw some text released last week during the recess. They'll have to move forward with that. The one provision that seems to have gotten a lot of attention is $1 billion for the Secret Service for security upgrades on the White House grounds. It's not supposed to be for the ballroom, but there's a lot around the ballroom that this could cover, the underground work, security enhancements, things like that. But that $1 billion has been associated with the ballroom and got some pushback. So we'll see how that is faring once members come back and look at it and think about the next steps with that bill.
And then part of the conversation is what else to attach to that reconciliation bill, or what to attach to a third reconciliation bill, trying to get that through before the midterms. And there's a lot of talk about affordability measures, housing, healthcare, some other things. How are those conversations progressing?
This bill, the Reconciliation 2, needs to stay narrow just because of the way they set up that process. There's a lot of interest in the third, but also skepticism of getting it done just because of all the steps you'd have to go through. Key to that is the defense funding that the administration has asked for as part of a reconciliation process separate from funding. We'll see if they can do that. On the housing front, there's a separate housing bill that the House passed one version of, the Senate passed another, and there's some interest in trying to maybe have a new House counteroffer to what the Senate passed. We'll see if that's coming together and can move across the floor. And then other affordability things, I'm sure that will be part of the discussion too. And oftentimes as you get closer to Memorial Day, energy prices, gas prices come to top of mind. And obviously that's been a pressure point in a lot of ways in recent weeks.
Well, that brings us back to the ongoing operations in the Middle East and around Iran. Not only defense supplemental funding, but actually authorizations for the use of force. Those conversations continue to come up and they continue to get defeated. Where are we at there now that we've crossed, or maybe not crossed, the 60-day line, depending on how you count?
It is depending on how you count and whether the operations are over. The administration says they're pretty much over, so the 60-day window is passed. But there was, over the last week, there was a member of Congress, I want to say from Michigan, a Republican, who has an authorization for the use of military force that would proactively said, here's what it should look like going forward. Here's the conditions I'd like to see on it. We'll see if his bill gains any traction. Senator Lisa Murkowski a couple of weeks ago had talked about maybe we should do an authorization, kind of not these votes to cancel or block what's happening, but shape what is happening and what may happen in the future. So we'll see if that debate is rejoined.
We have a lot to check in on the next time we talk.
Absolutely. And prediction markets are out there too. And that's been a big issue as well. That's another thing we'll be watching. So no shortage of things to pay attention to.
Lauren Duggan is Deputy News Director for Bloomberg Government. Lauren, thanks as always for joining me.
Thank you.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. The Office of Personnel Management is being urged not to shut down the combined federal campaign. More than 40 Democrats penned a letter to OPM warning that ending the CFC would be disastrous for the organizations that rely on it. The letter comes as the Trump administration is signaling a possible decommission of the decades-old program. Here with more details is Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for joining me.
Nice to be with you, Terry.
This is big news. What is the CFC and how long has it been around?
The Combined Federal Campaign, or CFC, has been around for more than 60 years at this point. It was a program that was founded under the Reagan administration, and the idea was to essentially make this sort of central point for federal employees to be able to contribute to different charitable organizations around the world. At this point, there are more than 4,000 charities that participate in the CFC and can receive donations from federal employees through it. And at this point, since it was founded, it's raised more than $9 billion for organizations around the world. It's an annual program that's run through OPM, and a lot of federal employees do participate in this.
What happened with the CFC last year?
Well, back in August last year, there was some sort of message from the White House where they seemed like they were interested in potentially shutting down the CFC. Back last August, there was a temporary hold for the 2025 Giving campaign. Ultimately, OPM, once the White House lifted this hold on it, OPM went ahead and ran the charity program later that fall. But OPM Director Scott Cooper said at the time that they only chose to continue with the 2025 CFC because at that point in the year, there were already many charities who had spent time and money preparing for that over the course of the year. So it was essentially going to be a waste of money not to run the campaign at that point. But they've generally expressed interest in, potentially shutting down the CFC. We haven't seen a final decision yet on whether it's going to be run this year. But when we look at last year's campaign, they raised about $40 million by the end of the year. It was a bit of a challenging year because of the government shutdown and other factors that were ongoing at that time.
Where are we now in consideration for this year's campaign, and the timing of that? Is the same argument perhaps going to come into play that agencies are already invested in it and maybe it's too late to stop?
It's not yet clear at this point. I haven't been able to get a final decision from OPM on whether or not they're going to continue running the program. But Trump administration officials, including OPM Director Scott Cooper, they've expressed reservations about the costs of keeping the program up and running this year and into the future. They say that generally they're evaluating changes to the CFC, and it is a possibility on the table of ending the program altogether, although, again, no final decision has been made there. But officials have said that there's administrative costs of running the program. An OPM spokesperson said it would cost $22 million in fees to be able to administer the program. So they are saying essentially it's potentially not worth it, or maybe there's some sort of alternative that they can do instead. Also, earlier this year, OPM decommissioned the online donation portal for the CFC. So that's at least a step or potentially a signal that they might not be running it this year. There's a message on the CFC website that says, quote, "This site may be taken offline at any moment." So although there's no final decision made, it seems to be heading in the direction of potentially this not continuing this year.
What points did the Democrats make in their letter to OPM?
They push back on this idea that the administrative or overhead fees are going to be an issue for the program. They say that if you look at the larger picture, CFC has actually saved the government hundreds of millions of dollars if you consider that these organizations are receiving donated funds from federal employees rather than potentially costing, federal tax dollars or federal spending or grants in some other way. So they say, even though there are administrative fees and they are supportive of potential reforms to the program, they believe that shutting it down fully would be actually very harmful to both government spending and then also to those organizations who do, in fact, rely on donations from federal employees year after year.
So what happens next, Drew? What will you be watching?
We'll be seeing whether and when OPM makes a decision to either run the 2026 campaign, potentially make more long-term decisions for the program. It seems like the main concern from the Trump administration's perspective here is really those administrative fees. So there could be some possibility that maybe if they're able to reduce those, then they may still run the program. At this point, I wasn't, again, able to get a final answer from OPM on their decision here, but it's something that we would likely see one way or the other in the next couple of months, because it does take several months of runway to be able to get the program up and running each year. So if they don't make a decision by, let's say, maybe August or September, I think that would make it difficult to run the CFC later this fall and winter.
And this isn't really any kind of referendum on the nonprofits who participate here or individuals who are making those contributions. That could all still happen outside the CFC umbrella.
That's right. It's not totally clear outside of just the simple cost part of the equation here, what, the purpose behind this. But, it's something where we haven't really seen a lot of dialogue or discussion about whether or not this is going to continue. So it's something just certainly to keep an eye on.
That's Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for sharing the story with us.
Absolutely. Thanks, Terry.
You can find the full details at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.